Well, what happens when you form a club and you make club rules, and then everybody decides after a while these rules are inconvenient. We're just going to disregard them. Um, NATO, of course, is in violation of its own um, rules. I mean, this is sort of what I call the morality clause of NATO, trying to establish NATO as a legitimate uh, organization within the framework of the United Nations organization. An organization of defense, meaning that the only time NATO would use military force would be if they were attacked, and then Article 51 comes into play. And so they set out and say we seek to resolve everything peacefully. We're not an aggressor organization. That clearly isn't the case today. NATO is a violent organization. War is its business. It exists only for war. It exists to use the threat of military force and actual military violence in pursuit of its collective policies, and more realistically, as an extension of American foreign and national security, policy. I think what they do is they throw lip service out there. Their idea of peaceful resolution would be for Russia to capitulate. Russian capitulation would bring about a peaceful resolution to this problem, but Russia is not going to capitulate because the problem was created by NATO and NATO members. I mean, we cannot separate the policies of France and Germany from NATO when it comes to the Minsk agreements. And we now know that France and Germany went forward to create the conditions of trapping the Russians in a so-called ceasefire that allowed NATO and Ukraine to stall for time, because at the same time France and Germany are stalling for time to build a Ukrainian army. NATO's building the Ukrainian army. The United States and NATO trainers are building the Ukrainian army. How is that peaceful? And what was the purpose of that Ukrainian army? It's not that I have to speculate. The United States Department of Defense put up a slide that said every 55 days we train a Ukrainian battalion to NATO standards so that they can go here, and they draw an arrow to eastern Ukraine to fight Russians. So it's not peaceful. There's nothing peaceful about NATO. Its charter is, especially Article 1, just shows the hypocrisy of NATO today. And thank you for pointing that out. And first of all, your pronunciation of the words are better than I do. So
thank you. It's not easy sometimes, to pronounce those words. But I want to ask you, so in this case, if this article number 1 is clearly not respected,
correct.
What organization or who is looking over it? Who is, let's say, the judge of it to say, all right, NATO, you are not respecting the article number 1? Who is it? Is it United Nations?
No, NATO is not beholden to the United Nations. NATO is a collective security arrangement, a treaty that operates outside of the framework of the United Nations. So the Secretary General of the United Nations has no impact on it. NATO is beholden to no one but its collective membership. That's about it. So they police themselves.
So it's like a gang.
Good job. You nice. I like that. Can I steal that? Because I'm going to use that.
Please, because this is my very simple way of thinking about things, as I'm not an expert in any of this, as we know. Okay, Scott, let's go to question number 2, which is something that came to me this morning. I was thinking, we look at the map of Russia, okay? The border length with the countries that are neighbors of Russia, I will say 5 countries, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4 countries here. So the length of the borderline, Kazakhstan has, it will be in kilometers, by the way, not miles. Kazakhstan has 7,512 kilometers, China 4,209, Mongolia 3.485, and Ukraine almost 2,000, 1,925. My question is, why they have chosen, let's call them those evil forces, Ukraine, to do their operation against Russia? Because we know this is all about resources, because ultimately it's after China. I mean, it's just like, it's like a screenplay. Why they have chosen Ukraine instead of Kazakhstan, Scott? Kazakhstan's borderline is 7,512 kilometers.
When you study the formation of Russia, the history of Russia, Ukraine is an integral part of that history. Ukraine is Russia. Now, I know the Ukrainians out there can say, no, Ukraine's Ukraine. The land we call Ukraine, Kievan Rus, etc., is an integral part of the formation of the Russian nation, the Russian state. They are inseparable, inseparable. You cannot consider a Russian state void of most of what we call Ukraine today. I mean, Western Ukraine is an anomaly, but the rest of Ukraine, Kiev, the Donbass, Crimea, even though that's always been Russian, that is part of the development of the Russian nation, not the Russian Federation, the Russian nation, which is bigger than the Russian Federation. The Russian nation encompasses the people, the religion, the culture, the language, and Ukraine is an integral part of that. Kazakhstan is not. Kazakhstan was acquired through conquest. Kazakhstan was part of the Russian manifest destiny moving, to the east. It's eastward expansion. So, if someone talks about stripping away Kazakhstan from the Russian orbit, that's not it's not an existential threat to Russia. Clearly Russia wants to have good relations with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has been a part of the Russian nation. It's part of the Russian Empire, part of the Soviet Union, and today, it's they have close relations. But the Kazakh people are a distinct people, distinct language, distinct religions, distinct culture, separate from the Russian nation, so to speak. Ukraine's not. So when one wants to talk about dealing a fatal blow to the Russian nation, you strip away that which is most important to it. And stripping away Ukraine from Russia would weaken Russia. It weakens Russia on any number of levels. First of all, there's the geopolitical aspect of having this giant chunk of territory suddenly part of NATO, right in the heart, within striking distance of Moscow. But there's also the psychological factor. I mean, the Russian nation just lost a big part. The founding part. When you talk about the history of the formation of the Russian nation, we don't speak about Moscow. We speak about Kiev. Kievan Rus. That is it right there, the heart of it, the heart of of what has become Russian Orthodoxy, the Russian language, the Russian people, spread from there to Moscow, from there to St. Petersburg, from there to all other points. That's the heart of it. So this is why stripping away Ukraine is so important. It's a psychological aspect. It's also, a lot of resources, a lot of industry. Ukraine was developed as an industrial state by the Soviet Union, under the Soviet Union. And the Russian economy was the Soviet economy. When we speak about the Soviet Union, if you had gone into the Soviet Union in the 1970s and said, can you guys envision a period of time where all the Soviet republics are gone and it's just Russia? They say, no, this is the Soviet Union. We travel freely to these republics. Everything went to Moscow, including, the economies were operated out of Moscow. And so, the Ukrainian economy was heavily dependent upon Russia, and Russia was heavily dependent upon the Ukrainian economy. There are these links there that continue to exist. The war has complicated it, but even prior to that, there were these links. There's the cultural links, there's the historical links, there's the economic links. And so I think this goes back to that 2019 study done by Rand Corporation. I mean, it talked about the best way to cause the collapse of Russia is to strip Ukraine away from its orbit.
So that was mainly because of the psychological impact it will have on Russian people.
Well, there's geopolitical aspects and economic aspects, but it's also, it would be devastating to the Russian nation. I have a knock at the door, and I have to get this, or else this will never end. So please forgive me.
No problem. Hello, everyone. We're waiting again. Let's wait. By the way, thank you so much for your patience. This is just me now. I can't believe that many of you are waiting over an hour. So this says a lot. So let's wait for Scott, and we will continue in a second. It's a waiting day.
Until I make enough money to get that studio apartment and I can build a studio away from everything, I apologize. This is what happens when you work from home.
Thank you, Scott. No, don't worry. It's like, in a way, humorous. Like, what a day. We just keep on waiting today. And I'm very patient, so I think I attracted patient audience as well.
You sound like
I want to ask
you sound like my wife. I'm always waiting for you, Scott. I'm always waiting. You're late. Anyways.
By the way, I have to say to everyone, we had so many interviews, me and Scott was never, ever late. It was like marine precision, Swiss watch, on time. And then I got my karma back twice because Scott was extending our interviews and someone else was paying the price. So there you have it. This is how it works in the universe. It's, not the energy goes like this, never wasted. Anyway, Scott, going back to our conversation, what to expect from the Wagner group in Belarus? Simple question.
It looks like, well, first, before we go on, I made the mistake of turning on the comments. And so Elena is holding me to task about Novgorod the Great and Novgorod Rus and all that. And I just want to make sure that I'm not discounting that aspect of it too. But Kievan Rus is also a critical part. But now I should probably turn off those comments because I'll be spending the whole day reading those and not paying attention to your questions. So there, the comments are off, but
yeah, it's distracting, I know. So what to expect from this Wagner group being positioned there? And then I continue with this region.
Well, understand that the Wagner in Belarus is not the Wagner that existed in Lugansk. In Lugansk, it was a division-sized military formation, heavily equipped with tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, etc., provided to them by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Wagner had to turn in all of that equipment. So what you're getting in Belarus is Wagner manpower. Now, Wagner has a twofold mission out of Belarus, and this is interesting. They are, of course, they have signed a training agreement with the Belarus government, and they are providing training to select units, territorial defense units, etc. They're doing that, but they are also continuing their activities in Africa. And indeed, many of the Wagner fighters who have gone to Belarus will be rotating out. There's a Wagner rotation in Africa that, because of the fight in Ukraine, hasn't been able to rotate out, several thousand strong, and they're due to rotate back. They'll be going to Belarus, or some of them will be given the option of signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Others will be rotating into Africa, and that's a significant part of the ongoing mission. The Russian government has made it clear that it plans to continue to use Wagner in Africa as a security assistance organization, and we see Wagner, the potential role of Wagner expanding with the recent coup d'état in Niger, a place where American Special Forces had been training the Niger security forces. There's some talk that maybe Wagner will now step in and fill that vacuum, expanding its role in West Africa. So Wagner will be there. Wagner's in Belarus training. The one thing Wagner isn't is this division-sized unit ready to strike in Poland or strike down into Ukraine. It's not organized for that. It's not equipped for that at this juncture. And my understanding is that the Belarus government isn't at this stage planning on converting Wagner into a standalone combat unit. I mean, Lukashenko joked about it with Putin in St. Petersburg, saying that Wagner wants to go to Poland. But how would Wagner go to Poland? They don't have any tanks. They don't have any artillery. They don't have any armored fighting vehicles. And frankly speaking, there's not that many of them. I mean, what we don't know what the total numbers are right now. 8,000.
Why would they want, Scott? Sorry, why would they want to go to Poland?
It was a joke. It was simply to threaten.
I mean, yeah,
it's
like what
it's
for? Yeah.
It's one of these silly, testosterone-driven machismo jokes that guys make in combat. You have the Polish government threatening to send troops in, the Polish government sticking out its chest, the Polish government doing this, that, and the other thing, and you have Wagner saying, "Bring it on." It's meaningless talk because it's not backed up by anything real.
Thank you. So that region that is called Suwalki corridor. What do you think? Because there were some statements made here in Russia about that area. What do you think will be happening there? Do you feel like there will be some kind of action taking place, or this is just very, let's say, sensitive spot on the map?
Well, from a NATO, understand that this the Suwalki corridor, the perceived vulnerability there is purely until recently a NATO construct, meaning NATO invented it. Because Belarus was not, I mean, even though they had close links with the Russian military, Belarus was not a staging ground of the Russian military. So it's not as though the Russian military was staged right there to move north along the Suwalki corridor. Yes, Russian troops were in Kaliningrad, and that links to it. But this is just it's a seam between Poland and Lithuania that is weak because the Poles haven't forward deployed their defenses there. Neither have the Lithuanians. So there's this border area that is a seam, a weakness in NATO's otherwise, iron curtain that theoretically could be exploited by the Russians. They could punch through the Suwalki corridor and cut the Baltics off from Poland. That's the notion. There was no reason for Russia to even consider doing this. Russia doesn't sit there and spend their every waking moment thinking, how can we defeat NATO? How can we do this? Russia's not like NATO. Russia doesn't promote, wars of aggression. However, the Baltic states have made moves since the initiation of the special military operation to isolate Kaliningrad. There's talk about a naval blockade or a blockade of the ports, blocking the trains. That's an act of war. And then the question is now, what does Russia do in response to that? And so now it's come in, people are saying that the Suwalki corridor might be ideal to create a land bridge that would connect Belarus with Kaliningrad to guarantee the connectivity of this. That's a plan. But once a land bridge means you're going to war against NATO. And so now the question is the quickest way to defeat the Baltic states to operate through the Suwalki corridor, which is undefended, meaning you're not going to accomplish your task of defeating the land armies of Lithuania or Poland? Or are there better ways to go in and deliver the knockout blow to the Baltic states? And I would say that the Suwalki corridor would be the last place Russia would go into. That if they're going to take out the Baltic states, there's more direct ways of getting to the respective capital cities and terminating the political existence of these states. So who knows? Again, I'm not a Russian diplomat. I don't sit here and write Russian point papers, and maybe there's someone there that's thinking differently, and God bless them. That's what they're allowed to do. But just from a purely military driven standpoint, it's not what I would be doing if I want to knock out the Baltic states. It's a waste of resources. There are sufficient resources in Kaliningrad. They don't need to be reinforced from the land out of Belarus. It's a diversion of forces. It's unnecessary. it's better to take your forces and take them where they'll have the greatest impact. And that would be closing with and destroying NATO forces in the Baltics, and then eliminating the political decision makers that prompted this to begin with. The people who are talking about a Kaliningrad blockade, people are talking about turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, things of that nature. Those are threats, existential threats to Russia's security, and Russia has every right to prepare to respond accordingly. And I think Russia has plans in place to remove the Baltic nations as a threat to Russia if that ever came to pass.
I had a question, Scott, on my latest live stream with the Duran. And I want to apologize if this lady is watching. What I will do for you, because I didn't ask the Duran your question, I will ask Scott your question. And if I have another conversation maybe with the Duran, I will ask the Duran again the same question, because I feel bad we didn't talk about it. It's a great question for Scott too. Fiona's question was, what will be the effect of Russia's victory on NATO and European Union?
NATO has backed itself into a corner, or a rhetorical corner and a policy corner. They've said that they can't accept a Russian victory. They're going to have to deal with it because Russia's winning. They're also committed now. They've doubled down on stupid, as I like to say, about creating the mechanism of confrontation with Russia. Let's just be clear right now. What should have emerged from the Vilnius summit was the reality that NATO is a paper tiger, that NATO has zero genuine combat capacity, that NATO is incapable, as it's currently organized, to wage large-scale ground combat in Europe. They look good on paper, but let's just examine a couple things. One, Stoltenberg talked about creating a 300,000 strong rapid response force. They already have a 40,000 strong rapid response force. It can't respond rapidly anywhere. It's a joke. It hasn't exercised in its full capacity. It exists on paper only, and it has zero combat power. I mean, it's not there. Plus, what have we done? The American component of that, I think, is the paratroopers. We're not going to sit there and let them fight with a bunch of NATO forces. If we go to war, they're going to be part integrated. So it's a joke organization. Now they're talking about making it a 300,000 strong. Who's going to pay for it? Where are they going to get the troops? But here's the other thing. How are they going to train? How do you train 300,000 men from all over NATO? Where do you bring them together? This is expensive. The Marine Corps didn't get to be and I know I'm glad I turned off the comments because I always get people mad at me when I say this, but we're the world's premier combat force. There's nobody who can beat us. Never happened, never will. And one of the reasons why we're that way is, we believe in ourselves. Believe me, in combat, believing in yourself goes a long way. Doubt gets you killed. Aggressiveness, when you're paired up with other aggressive people, you tend to win, especially when you're highly trained, which means you're spending all your time when you're not engaged in war, preparing for war, thinking about it, training for it, getting those muscles working the right way. And we train all the time. And you train for the wars you're going to fight. If all the Marine Corps did is train small unit tactics, and then we were called upon to perform a multi-division sized operation, we wouldn't do so well because we'd be stumbling around going, how do we coordinate regimental operations? How do we link together? What's the command? It would collapse. You have to train for it. How is NATO going to train to use 300,000 troops? They're not. They don't know how to do it. They're not going to do it. It's too expensive. So this is a force that exists on paper only, and nobody can afford it. I'd be surprised if NATO generated half that many forces for this. But that's the problem, is NATO's positioned itself for a confrontation that it can't afford to get into. And whatever they do, it's going to come too late because Russia is going to win the Ukraine conflict sooner rather than later. This is not going to be a forever war. Now, the good news is that there are winds of political change taking place in Europe. Governments are starting to fall. Governments are at risk. Even ones that might not fall, like France. I don't think Macron's out the door yet. But Macron is a guy who is starting to say the right things, like a new European security framework. That's actually the words that Russia put in their draft treaty back in December of 2021, a new European security framework. That's what Russia's looking for. And you're starting to hear people in NATO talk about this, about the need for a new European security framework, one that recognizes Russia's legitimate national security interests. Again, Russian terminology that everybody ignored in 2021. They can't ignore it today. So one of the most likely things that's going to happen is that the Russian victory will cause NATO to regroup and rethink where it's going. Now, this is going to be an interesting discussion because the Poles and the Balts are all about leaning forward. They want those 300,000 troops. They want, aggressive defense spending. They want NATO to commit to the forward defense of Europe, or as they see Europe. But the rest of NATO may not want that. They decide that no, what we need to do is de-escalate. So the most likely consequence of the Russian victory is the initiation of a broad dialogue within the framework of NATO and within the framework of the European Union about what its future is. Where do they want to go? You have economies that are failing right now. I mean, Germany's heading down the drain. The United Kingdom down the drain. Italy is struggling. France is struggling. The last thing they need to do is get involved in a military restructuring of Europe that has them investing hundreds of billions of euros that they don't have. They don't have that money anymore. So I think what we're looking at is the beginning of a dialogue. It'll be a difficult dialogue because there will not be unity. And I also think it's basically planting the seeds of the end of NATO, because NATO is a consensus-driven organization. And when you start to have several cliques inside this gang, as you called it, this sub-gangs, and they're going to say, well, that's not in our interest. We don't want to be part of this anymore. That's not why we're part of NATO, et cetera. I think you're going to start to see fracturing of NATO politically, and that will lead to the eventual demise of NATO. And I think this is the likely outcome. It'll take decades to unfold. It won't happen overnight. But I think what you'll see, the Russian victory will set in motion the condition. Because here's the most important aspect of the Russian victory. It's not necessarily all about what NATO is going to do. It's about what Russia is going to do, or more importantly, what Russia isn't going to do. And Russia isn't going to organize to continue the fight against NATO. Russia will build a robust military that can defend itself. NATO is expanding. Finland, Sweden, even though Sweden's not quite in yet, but Russia will have to build military capacity to deal with this, and this is going to look threatening to some people in NATO. But again, genuine military experts know the difference between a defensive-oriented organization and one that is geared towards offensive action. The Soviet army that was stationed in East Germany, in Poland and elsewhere, was an offensive-oriented army. Even though the forward elements trained to receive a NATO attack before they counterattacked, everything was geared on moving forces to the west offensively. I don't think you're going to see that from the new Russian military. I think you're going to see a new Russian military that's geared towards being able to defend critical parts of Russia from a NATO attack, and then launch a counterattack afterwards. So I think Russia will actually position itself to be more about economic and social reconstruction of the new Russian territories, solving the problem of Ukraine. What do you do with the post-Ukraine, post-conflict Ukraine? Because it's not in Russia's interest. We talked earlier about the importance of Ukraine. It's not in Russia's interest to turn Ukraine into a cancerous cesspool that can continuously exist to infect Russia. It's actually in Russia's interest to get Ukraine back up on its feet and to become reintegrated in a peaceful way with not just Russia, but the European Union. So I think you're going to see that Russia is going to do something that NATO apparently has forgotten how to do. That's called wage diplomacy. That Russia is going to, engage diplomatically across the board. And in doing so, and by doing that, I think Russia is going to help diffuse a lot of the angst that exists in places like Poland, like the Baltics, like Romania, frontline states who are very concerned about what a Russian victory could mean because they feel vulnerable. Many of them should probably start to reassess what value NATO brings, because all NATO has brought is death, destruction, ruination. NATO has brought nothing good, nothing positive to any of them.
Thank you so much for this. I was ready to ask you my next question, but now with what you were saying, I want to ask you this. A few days ago, I was reading an article I found in one of the Polish on one of the Polish portals. That was talking about how important women are in Ukraine for Ukraine's GDP, for the economy of Ukraine. I don't remember now exactly the number, how many women left, and Ukraine is desperate at this point for them to come back with children after the conflict. So Scott, how they are going to rebuild this? How they are going to take care of that, whatever remains there, since, as we know, majority of those women will never return to that land again.
Ukraine has shot itself in the foot. I mean, it's created this problem for itself, and sometimes problems can't be solved. Sometimes problems create a new paradigm, a new reality, and you have to adjust to that. I don't think Ukraine is going to be able to return to pre-war Ukraine. First of all, no matter what, they've lost 20% of their country. They're never going to get that back. If this war continues, there's a possibility they could lose even more. And it's not just the Russians doing territorial acquisition, but you have Poland actively conspiring with the Lithuanian government about making a move into Western Ukraine. And if once you get into the business of dismembering Ukraine, then the Hungarians have a claim, and the Carpathians, the Romanians have a claim, and you're just going to see chunks of Ukraine taken out until what's left is, this little rump state built around